Abbiamo una minuta di più, sì? Good afternoon. Greetings to everyone with us. On behalf of the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, I would like to welcome you at another lecture of the JP2 Lectures series this academic year. The series is organized by St. John Paul II Institute of Culture, which is part of our Faculty of Philosophy here at the Angelicum. Today's lecture, as well as the entire JP2 lecture series, could not have taken place without the support of our university authorities, whom I would like to thank. Special thanks are also owed to the founders of JP2 Institute of Culture, donors and supporters of the Institute, our audience and all viewers in front of their screens who are joining us via internet connection. The St. John Paul II Institute of Culture was established to look at the challenges facing the modern world and the Church in light of the thought and heritage of St. John Paul II. The idea of thinking with John Paul II has been embodied in the JP2 lecture series, which are monthly lectures of prominent interdisciplinary scholars who revisit extraordinary contributions of John Paul II for our own day. Today it's my great honor to introduce to you, if it's necessary, Father Professor Cezary Binkiewicz, the director of the St. John Paul II Institute, who has been with us in this project for several years now. Father Binkiewicz is a Polish Dominican and philosopher, a doctor of philosophy of the Polish Academy of Science. In his work, he focused on analytical philosophy and anthropology. His doctoral dissertation, entitled Personal Identity and Morality, was written under the supervision of Professor Robert Piłat at the Polish Academy of Science in Warsaw. Professor Binkiewicz was vice rector of the Dominican Philosophical and Theological College in Warsaw for 5 years and has been the director of the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture, the Angelicum, since 2021. And a word about the topic of lecture. In his lecture today, titled The True and the Search for a New Paideia, Professor Binkiewicz will address the questions whether the connection between true and education still exists in today's culture, whether it's needed, and therefore whether education has any well-legitimized purpose. Thank you very much. Professor Binkiewicz, the floor is yours.
Quem dii oderunt pedagogum fecerunt, whom the gods hated, they made them pedagogus, says the Latin proverb. As you probably know, classical paideia was supposed to educate, shape a young person to full entelechy, perfection, so that he could take on family and, above all, civic responsibilities in a responsible and mature manner. In the classical model, this shaping took place for the sake of truth, goodness, and beauty. In my lecture, devoted to truth and contemporary pedagogy, I omitted the issue of beauty primarily for reasons of time. I have linked the issue of goodness with the issue of truth, because I would like us not to lose sight of education in the truth about goodness in the debate on contemporary paideia. I was primary school teacher for a very short time in my life. Therefore, I understand perfectly how the Latin saying quoted above can be accurate. However, I'm not a professional educator in the strict sense, so my considerations will not focus on methods or tools within pedagogy itself. The task I have set myself is of a more general nature. I would like to look at whether the connections between truth and education still exist in today's culture, whether it is needed, and therefore whether education has any well-legitimized purpose. This is, in my opinion, important because our Western culture, which grew out of the Greek-Christian Paideia and today defines itself as postmodern, to a large extent negates and undermines this connection. In this lecture, I would like to raise the problem of the crisis of education, which is to a large extent the result of the lack of integral concept of man, person, the crisis of the concept of truth and values, which is strongly correlated with the crisis of education. Finally, I would like to present a general outline of a concept of education that tries to shape a person in accordance with the truth about himself as a person living in society. Do we have a crisis of education? If we assume that in common sense the term education means any purposeful influence of guardians, educators on pupils in order to shape in them certain concepts, feelings, attitudes, and aspirations, then the question mark regarding the crisis of education has a highly provocative nature. Pedagogy is, after all, a field that has a social impact due to the universal educational system on the one hand, and its subject matter which must necessarily include philosophy, psychology, and sociology on the other. It is therefore hardly surprising that there are those who believe that the crisis in education is necessary and constantly present, because thanks to it, education can achieve increasingly better results. Therefore, according to them, there is no reason to worry. Others are convinced that there is no crisis. And still others claim that the greatest crisis is the failure to notice that existing crisis, so severe that it threatens the foundations of civilization. Let me remind you that Jean-Jacques Rousseau was convinced that education is endemically burdened with an internal difficulty leading to crisis. In Emile, we can read, I quote him, "The natural man lives for himself. He is the unit, the whole, dependent only on himself and on his like. The citizen is but the numerator of a fraction, whose value depends on its denominator. His value depends upon the whole, that is, on the community. Good social institutions are those best fitted to make a man unnatural, to exchange his independence for dependence, to merge the unit in the group, so that he no longer regards himself as one, but as a part of the whole, and is only conscious of the common life." End of quotation. This state of affairs leads the French philosopher to the following sad conclusion. I quote him, Our inner conflicts are caused by these contradictions, drawn this way by nature and the way by man, compelled to yield to both forces. We make a compromise and reach neither goal. We go through life struggling and hesitating and die before we had found peace, useless alike to ourselves and to others. End of quotations. Without much exaggeration, we can say that, as Rousseau suggested, it is impossible to live without society, but it is also impossible to live with society. If we take this conclusion seriously, then the work of Hubertus von Schönberg, with the significant title Anti-Pedagogy, or Being and Supporting instead of Educating, may seem to be the only solution to the aporia of education. In one of this author's articles, we can read, and quote him, "No child needs to be raised by anyone. Those who love children do not raise them." End of quotation. Is there therefore a crisis of education in European culture? The fragment quoted above is, no doubt, as Professor Sołtysek also confirms in the following words. I quote him. "The crisis of contemporary pedagogy is a simple consequence of its cutting itself from its philosophical source, cutting off pedagogy from its roots, flooding these roots with scientific and dogmatic concrete, has led to a systematic increase in moral and intellectual confusion. An eloquent testimony of what is: 1. Confusions of concepts and contradictory ambiguity of use names and words. And 2. Producing pseudo-definitions and mutually negating so-called theories of education. This chaos created by teachers directly affects the low culture of the educational process." End of quotations. The multiplicity of philosophical concepts of man and the crisis of education. It is impossible to approach the truth about man without trying to answer the questions about identity. Who am I and who are you? The answers to these questions are often influenced by our unconscious assumptions. The person who believes that human life is slightly less than the life of angels and is convinced that it is possible to live after death has a completely different concept of man than the person who claims that human life is only a special variety of animal life. The bidding war between the vision of man as a bunch of genes existing without purpose and the vision of man as a creature that is the fruit of God's love is a modern version of an age-old philosophical debate. Is man merely shaped by unconscious physical forces, or it is part of his nature to constantly exceed his own limitations? We live in a time when the more we emphasize our freedom and independence, the more we try to avoid responsibility by pointing out that the real perceptors of our life events are social and psychological forces. Many philosophical trends in the last century have taught us that we cannot know our own nature. The result of such an education can be nihilism. Since I do not know who I am, knowledge of man person can be illusory. The question of human nature is important not only for the individual, but also for society. To what extent do we need interpersonal bonds? Is our life even possible without them? To what extent does society temper, perhaps even destroy? And to what extent does it develop my inner inclinations? It is impossible to talk sensible about ethics, create rational laws, educational systems, or build efficiently functioning states without giving some specific answer to the questions about human nature. It seems natural to believe that man is an entity that functions both in the space of mental and physical events. However, many thinkers find it problematic to explain such functioning. The question of the relationship between the mental and the physical is for many philosophers one of the most important problems that contemporary philosophy must face. For Thomas Nagel, for example, finding the right answer to this question, it is possible at all, is of such fundamental importance that it could completely change our concept of the universe. Difficulties also arise from the fact that man is the object of various specific sciences. I quote him, "The problem before us is how to preserve or restore a concept of man that would do justice to his humanity and, most importantly, recognize the unity of the human person in the face of the dispersion of data, facts, and discoveries constantly provided by a thoroughly compartmentalized science." End of quotation. With these words, Viktor Frankl began his lecture at a conference of doctors in Austria in 1968. These are words that have not lost their relevance today. The diversity and richness of specific sciences can, on the one hand, lead to the discovery of a fuller knowledge of who a human is. But on the other hand, it also carries the danger of losing the harmonious unity of these different aspects. Attempts to find the right answer to the question, who is a human being, is a real dispute taking place before our eyes. Without going into intricate details, and at the same time applying a slight simplification, we can say that theories that try to answer the question, what is the nature of man, are located on both sides of the demarcation line, which is determined by the relationship to the absolute, consequently by reference to truth and values. We see this most clearly by relating the philosophies of Pascal and Sartre to each other. Pascal's anthropology flows from absolute and is fulfilled in the absolute. In the case of Sartre, the total negation of any dimension of the absolute leads to an absurdity, in relation to which the search for the so-called nature of man is also absurd. As a society, we live in a cultural space that is today called postmodernity, for which the utilitarian nature of phenomena seems to be fundamental. In the description of the world, including man, it is not essential to capture objective truth. Any description is good to the extent that it is useful. In a sense, the manner of description determines nature. There is no false description, just different purposes. If every description is equivalent, then every concept of man is equally valid and legitimate. The difference that is supposed to be factual is abolished. And at the same time, one of the basic tasks of philosophy, which is determine and describe differences, loses its fundamental meaning. I'm deeply convinced that postmodernism, by blurring the boundaries between truth and falsehood, and good and evil, is the main cause of chaos and difficulties that arise when trying to define an adequate concept of man. Bocheński writes about the resulting threat as follows, I quote him, "Humanity, perhaps more so today than in other eras, blindly submits to savage instincts. Knowledge, reason are now threatened as they were rarely before. And along with them, what is simply human is also threatened, perhaps even the very existence of man." End of quotation. In order to find an adequate description of human being, person, one cannot ignore the fact that people's lives are inextricably linked to the activities in which they try to find the meaning of their existence. No one can find this meaning within themselves. They must, as it were, go beyond themselves to respond to everything, the world, other people, values, etc., that in some way turns towards them. To meet this requirement, the world to which people turn cannot be chaotic. It does not have to be perfect, but it should present and enable the realization of certain values. Węgrzecki calls this kind of meaningfulness of the world based on values axiological meaningfulness. Due to this axiological meaningfulness of the world, people often dissatisfied with the existence of certain values attempt to change them. This commitment to change is undertaken because the value demands realization. It should really exist. Even when it is already realized, there is still an obligation to implement it. Our intuition suggests that it is in the moral life that we have the primary experience of persons through discovering right and wrong relationship between people. It is not for nothing that the deepest reflections on the human person are revealed in moral reflection. Among many values, it is primarily moral values that have huge impact on the construction of a personal subject. Ingarden is convinced that, for example, nobility, which is associated with the realization of a good moral life, influences the structure of existence itself and entails a certain internal unification of men. Moreover, like many other psychologists and philosophers, he believes that failure to overcome moral conflicts that arise as a result of changes in preferred moral values is a significant obstacle to achieving the unification of a person in his or her deepest structures. Being a person is not just about achieving some goals, but about achieving them decently within a certain horizon of good. Charles Taylor writes about it in the following way. I quote him: "Self-awareness is the awareness of one's own attitude towards norms. And the choice that is unique to a human being is one that is made with knowledge of these norms." End of quotations. The success achieved in the natural sciences, thanks to objectifying methods, rejecting anthropocentric properties, gave reason to apply similar methods in the analysis of man himself. In order to achieve this goal, anthropological objectivity, it is necessary to marginalize the importance of the concept of meaning, because only it is a guarantee that something else counts in an authentic and not derivative way. It does not seem that we can explain in an absolutist way, omitting the subject himself and his sensitivity to norms. Such concepts as shame, pride, guilt, or moral good, which seems to have no proper justification without reference to the objective nature of man. Taylor emphasizes that even in the naturalistic view of man, there is a desire to place oneself in the world in such a way as to determine what is really important. Consciously or not, these concepts confirm that striving for what is more than human is a fundamental part of human life, and appears even where it should not appear pragmatically. One thing is obvious. Either we can look at our lives with the hope of the continuation after their death, or we cannot. We can either see ourselves as being able to free ourselves from the constraints of time and place, or not. We can see ourselves as bound by forces completely beyond our control, society, etc., or as those who are able to cope with these forces. We certainly cannot escape from making a choice. How we will live our lives depends only on this choice. It also seems that truth is at the basis of all searches, because without distinguishing between what is true and what is false, all searches seem to lose their meaning. Konrad Lorenz, a Nobel Prize winner in the second half of the last century, drew our attention to the consequences of abandoning the effort to seek what is good, noble, and true writing. I quote him. Most of the spiritual diseases and disturbances that call into question the continued existence of our culture concern the ethical and moral behavior of men. In order to find appropriate countermeasures, we need a natural science insight into the causes of this pathological phenomena, which requires breaking down the wall separating natural science from the humanities. There is no reason to doubt that truth will ultimately prevail, but the question is whether it will prevail in time. End of quotation. Truth and values. Allow me to begin this part of my lecture with the words of Fernandez Armesto from his work, The History of Truth. I quote him. The search for truth is an eternal and universal aspiration of human beings. Yet, many of us today seem to consciously abandon it. The suspicion that reality is unknowable and inexpressible is as old as the quest to discover the whole truth. But perhaps never has it been as widely heard, as influential, and as dangerous to the very concept of truth as it is in our times. Against the background of the history of the search for truth, the current indifference seems an unexpected, unusual, and dangerous novelty. Such a search undertaken with deep convictions has always been a source of inspiration and a stimulus to action. Thanks to it, progress was made and civilizations developed. By abandoning them, we are not sure whether we will go even a step further or whether we will survive as a species at all. End of quotations. Perhaps the crisis at the turn of the century is a special property of European culture, because about 100 years ago, Edmund Husserl, in Logical Investigations, argued that there is nothing more wrong than building a theory that implicitly or explicitly denies the possibility of its evaluation in terms of truth. Postmodernism renounces such a possibility of evaluation, believing that the very concept of truth is unnecessary. I think that Krystyna Wilkoszewska sums up this approach to truth very aptly. I quote her. But what if absolute truth came? With it would come the end of everything, history, movement, life. For truth conceals within itself the rigidity of death. The connections between truth and death is revealed in the apocalyptic vision. It is not about revelation through destruction, but about truth, that is, destruction. The longing for truth is the desire for annihilation. End of quotation. Please see that from this perspective, any effort to make the pupil become a good person in himself or herself and good member of society is illusory. If anyone wants to shape people towards goodness, they must be convinced that this goodness is real. In other words, true. Already Aristotle understood goodness as a goal of specific aspirations, because it is the object of will. However, if this does not follow an adequate recognition of this good, it may pursue fictitious goals, but also goals that bring measurable evil. The truth, therefore, guards this good. Good, as St. Thomas Aquinas said, cannot be reduced to truth, but the natural striving for the truth about a given being is at the same time a striving for the truth about the good. A political dispute, A scientific congress, or finally the construction of educational theories, and the entire creative mental effort makes sense only to the extent that it brings us closer to the truth. In the case of naturalists, to the truth about the world. In the case of educators, to the truth about the good of the pupils. Joseph Tischner writes in his volume devoted to thinking according to values as follows. I quote him. Within thinking, there is not only preferential rebellion, but also preferential acceptance. Thinking as acceptance is thinking with respect to the value of truth. It seeks to distinguish truth from untruth. Truth is the ideal value of this thinking. To recognize the truth, to understand a person you meet, you have to let them be. You have to enter into a dialogue with them. Ask them what they think. Look for an answer when they ask a question. End of quotation. Truth as a value. I do not wish to discuss here the various conceptions of truth, from the classical to the deflationary. Personally, I am a supporter of the adequacy theory of truth, according to which we recognize a judgment as true when it's consistent with the existing state of affairs to which the judgment refers. If I say that the chemical substance called water is a compound of hydrogen and oxygen atoms, and in fact it is, then my statement is true. Truth, understood in this way, carries a certain value that is not only cognitive in nature. It allows us to hope that even if we do not always gain exhaustive access to a specific reality, it creates a common foundation of meaning. This common worldview is necessary. Otherwise, in every attempt to understand the other, we would destroy the meaning of our reading of what other says. In other words, I know how my adversary differs only when we have a common reference. This common reference is never really commented one because it is trivial. But without it, there can be no argument. We see, therefore, that even a dispute is not possible without a far-reaching reciprocity. Objective error can occur, according to Davidson, only in the setting of beliefs that are largely true. He himself writes about this as follows. I quote him. Consent does not produce truth, but much of what we agree to must be true. If any of what we agree, this is false. End of quotations. Truth in the classical approach is not only the agreement of our judgment with a given state of affairs, but also the agreement of think with an absolute idea, or as in the Christian approach, agreement with the absolute mind of God. This transcendental character of truth gives it, if I may say so, a metaphysical value. The belief that we can make true judgments about the reality around us is only possible because the people and things among whom we are can be summarized in specific laws and are in cause and effect relationship with each other. They are not chaotic, and as Heraclitus would have it, they are not so changeable that it is impossible to formulate adequate judgments about them. This truthfulness, not of judgment, but of being itself, which is true, has its own nature, thanks to absolute reference, is the condition of truth in the epistemological sense. This metaphysical dimension of truth is also reflected in our everyday language. Fortunately, we still sometimes say about this or that person, this is true friend, or here assurances, please don't worry, this is real gold. Transcendental truth, as Thomists are convinced, does not come only from the formal agreement of the world with God's infinite intellect, but from the agreement of the world and our mind with his whole essence, that is, from agreement with his other attributes, and in particular from agreement with his goodness. God, because he is good, created the world as a regular structure to enable finite beings to live and act in it. Our knowledge is therefore not only possible because being is true in the sense of being in agreement with the ideas in the mind of being with infinite intellect, but our knowledge is also possible because being is true in the sense of being in agreement with the infinite mind of a being who is good. Categorical truth, that is the correspondence between the intellect and the thing, can be realized only where transcendental truth exists. In all other situations, epistemic presence in the world of all kinds of finite beings is exposed to chance and to possibility of radical skeptical hypothesis. Both of these things, either chance and the possibility of a universal illusion, nullify any claim to truth and knowledge. Truth, in the transcendental sense, is an ontological value, immanently present in reality itself. Therefore, reality is not constructed by discovered on the basis of this truth. The world is not and does not have to be submissive in all our sic jubeo, and perhaps the necessity of recognizing this fact is the greatest challenge to our reason. John Searle, an American philosopher and defender of realism, writes about it. I quote him. "I have to confess, however, that I think there is a much deeper reason for the persistent appeal of all forms of anti-realism. And this has become obvious in the 20th century. It satisfies a basic urge to power. It just seems too disgusting somehow that we should have to be at the mercy of the real world. It seems too awful that our representations should have to be answerable to anything but us. This is why people who hold contemporary versions of anti-realism and reject the correspondence theory of truth typically sneer at the opposing view." End of quotation. Truth, being a value in itself, also carries with it its moral responsibility. It does not allow one to withdraw from what has been accepted by conscience as a good and decent. Leszek Kołakowski writes in his treatise on what is good and true as in this way, I quote him, "We acquire moral knowledge not because someone convinces us that Kant or Husserl or Plato were right, but because we are capable of and actually experience guilt when we violate rules that we know are valid." End of quotation. It is trivial to say that human actions can be subject to moral evaluation only when it is free. However, one cannot be free outside the truth. My actions cannot be good unless they realize the real true good. Conscience is also subject to this duty of looking to the good. Pope John Paul II writes in the encyclical in this way, I quote him, "Instead, there is a tendency to grant to the individual conscience the prerogative of independently determining the criteria of good and evil and then acting accordingly. Such an outlook is quite congenial to an individualist ethic, wherein each individual is faced with his own truth, different from the truth of others. Taken to its extreme consequences, this individualism leads to a denial of the very idea of human nature." End of quotation. Unable to reach the truth about good and evil, none of our actions could be subject to any moral specification. In conscience, truth is revealed on a particular level, because conscience judges whether a specific behavior complies with the law. Thanks to this reference to the fundamental truth about good and evil, the practical judgment of conscience imposes on man the obligation to perform a specific act and reveals the bond connecting freedom with truth. This judgment is not always correct, but it is bad when our conscience is wrong due to a lack of commitment to the search for truth, because it is the source of the dignity of consciousness. The revelation of truth in its transcendental dimension also reveals its inseparable bond with goodness. Truth is not only aletheia and concealment, but also emet, fidelity, constancy, reliability. Where there is emet, trust is possible. In this character of its truth fulfills a twofold function. On the one hand, it puts an end to uncertainty and the infinity of searches, assumptions, and suspicions, so that the place of these unstable states can be taken by the formed, strengthened in its self-evidence in the revealed state of things. On the other hand, it is the end of our uncertainty. It is a bad infinity of fertile opportunities in situations. From the present truth grows, as from a seed, 1,000 conclusions and 1,000 new knowledges. Truth never confines the knowing subject within itself. It is always an opening, not only towards itself and within itself, but towards further truth. It discovers existence and thus also the relationship occurring with it. It opens up a view into areas not yet known, but it contains within itself a movement towards further truth. Education based on truth and values. If in the process of education, the objective nature of values and truth is taken into account, first of all, in relation to human nature, and it is not forgotten that the pupil is a person among other people, and in the world of specific goods and values, then the tension or even contradictions about which Rousseau wrote does not have to be so sharp. Being a person, a social unit, or a citizen does not lead to a contradiction, as long as we remember that what is born and dies is first and foremost a person, and the person is primary in the process of upbringing. The first task of an educator, in my opinion, is to direct the educational process in a such way that a young person is able to notice and bring out what is most important in him as a human being from the perspective of moral good, expressed in the fundamental principle, do good, avoid evil. Schottise calls this basic level of education personal education, and education consists in bringing out what is hidden in a young person. At the same time, it is impossible to extract this good outside of the social context. As Schmemann emphasizes, persons are given through a specific act of recognition. I quote him, "Being a person is not something that is assumed, and if this assumption is strong, then it is recognized in a legal way. Rather, it is given only in the act of recognition. Our own personal being is not given to us prior to the personal being of other living beings. The granting of the status of a person is rather an expression of respect as a specific way in which persons are given to each other. This is the paradox. Respect, recognition are types of activity." End of quotations. Therefore, the natural next phase of educational care is social education, the aim of which is to shape pro-social skills, virtues that are consistent with recognized values responsible for proper relations in a given community. However, while personal education was about the moral good of the person, social education is about achieving the common good. Although personal education is ontologically first, it cannot be fruitful if social education is neglected. We are born into specific families and social groups, and there we acquire sensitivity to specific values. Miriam Akavia, an Israeli writer and translator who lost her loved ones during the Second World War, agreed to take part in a survey conducted by the editors of the monthly magazine Znak. In the same magazine, published in 1999, under the telling title, The Power of Good, she expressed herself as follows. I quote her, "My children did not know my parents, but despite the cruelest evil I had suffered, I raised them according to the same principles by which I was brought up and which instilled in me in childhood. Overcome the later evil, I am grateful to my parents for instilling in me the faith in the goodness. I am grateful to all the people in the world who each in their own way expand the circle of this goodness." End of quotation. The complement to all education is state education, the aim of which is also the common good, understood, however, in a broader context than the good of the family or small community, because it is open to the good of the entire state, which is a community of all communities that are part of it. Personalistic value and the educational process. Katarzyna Olbrycht, commenting on Wojtyła's Personalis, states that if we want to understand the concept of a person by analyzing his or her act, it is necessary to distinguish between the moral value of a given act and the personalistic value. Moral value is the value of a specific action with regard to its external and internal consequences. A personalistic value is a value that is created by the fulfillment of a personal act, and thus by the fulfillment of a person in the act. Consent to this value protects everyone, not only the pupil, from the impositions of even the highest values by force. Everyone, as St. Thomas Aquinas said, has the right to make mistakes and the right to freely seek the truth. Recognizing the person as a primary means that the educational process, in order to be effective and good, must respect the fact that the education of man is the education of a person, in which personalistic value is of fundamental importance. Following Olbrycht's solutions, I would like to outline the basic task that should be taken into account by anyone who wants to educate pupils. 1. The educator should give students the opportunity to get to know the concept of man as a person who achieves his perfection by realizing the truth about goodness. Such knowledge also enables the formation of interpersonal relationships that support personal development through respect for other people, cooperation, friendship, and love. 2. Strengthening the awareness that every person is entitled to inalienable and unconditional dignity, resulting from the fact that a human person is a physico-sociological spiritual being. Such a consolidated identity means that a person can build goodness within themselves, with every actions, and it also enables a better understanding of themselves and others by referring to everything that constitutes cultural identity. 3. Awareness and recognition of the existence of an objective hierarchy of values entails the necessity of character formation, which is achieved by exercising the will in a such way that it quickly and easily adheres to good and oppresses evil. The proper formation of the will is achieved, as Aristotle already knew, by acquiring 4 basic virtues: fortitude, prudence, temperance, and justice. 4. Another important element is the education of feelings, by subjecting them to intellectual control. Feelings in themselves are neither good nor bad morally. Our behavior under their influence already has such an evaluation. The ability to cope with negative emotions is extremely important. 5. Awakening the need and teaching contemplation. This cannot be achieved without practicing from an early age the ability to stay in silence, concentrate and focus on a selected object in order to satisfy needs that are not only pragmatic. Delight, admiration, and wonder are some of the fruits of such acquired skills. 6. A task that cannot be omitted is the education of conscience, which as an internal moral norm decides about good and evil and also constitutes an impulse to undertake or refrain from actions. A well-formed conscience is the basis for responsible action. And 7. Shaping attitudes towards others and their groups treated in a personal way. Although trivial, it must be said emphatically, because often the most basic truths are lost in detailed searches, that only those who are able to treat others personally are those who constantly experience such treatment themselves. Conclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, I am aware of the discussed issues in pedagogy and disputes about which solutions are the most suitable and appropriate. However, I am also deeply convinced that reducing the concept of truth and the world of values only to the utilitarian level ultimately makes an integral educational process impossible, which, if it is understood as achieving full self-ownership, one of the definitions of person, is a lifelong process and at a certain level turns into self-education. If a person is primary, then he or she is an irreducible value and, as Kant says, is an end in itself. No educator should forget about this. Otherwise, the educational process will be reduced to manipulation and forcing specific behaviors and beliefs. By basing the entire educational process on the truth that is beneficial today and not tomorrow, on values that ensure success today and not tomorrow, we will raise Zeliks and Piszczyks, but certainly not people who will take responsibility for themselves, their loved ones, closer communities, and the state in which they live. Let me conclude this lecture with the words of Professor Albrecht, with which I fully agree. I quote her. A person can become good throughout his or her entire life, not as a result of conforming to a rigid pattern and denying his or her individual qualities, and not by gaining the recognition of experts in human positivity in any sense, but by persistently striving for truth and goodness through the implementation of even small actions aimed at being faithful to the duties accepted in the light of truth, in one's own conscience. Working on fulfilling oneself as a person, working on oneself is the work of one's entire life. It is the skillful use of all one's qualities in striving for truth and goodness as one's own good and at the same time the common good. End of quotations, and thank you for your presence here.
Thank you, Professor, for your most interesting lecture. I would like to open a session of questions now. If you have any question to Professor, you are welcome. I see a hand.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you, Father, for this various lecture. My question is about the education process, because as we agree with the point that it's based on the relationship. So maybe our contemporary crisis is only like the fact about the universities. It's not the universitas, it's not like a community, and it's also the crisis starting point about the relation between master and the student. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. We see perfectly well by ages, maybe from the 19th century till today, that exclusion in some parts of university life was present. The first, morality. university life is not about the morality, but about the sciences, about the knowledge. So we expel morality from the university life. I remember when I first time reading about very famous logician and mathematician, United States, Sanders Peirce. He was expelled from the university life because he was divorced. So the authority of the university decided that he cannot be anymore the teacher of the young people because his morality is not quite well. So the first time we will see that morality was expelled and sciences. But lately I read a book about post-truth society. So post-truth society now means that now we have problem with brute facts in science. So we are functioning in the reality that we really don't know if some scientist has right or not, because we have so many different possibilities that now we discuss maybe it's true that vaccination is bad, vaccination is good. We discuss about the situation about climate problems. It's good or bad. We have a lot of authorities in one side and a lot of authorities in the second side. So now we have the problem with sciences at all now. So what else? I wonder what else? So that's my answer for this university and universitas. Of course, we remember that universitas was the idea to common life, common knowledge, common language, common values, which help us to achieve the most important goals. But we are now living in different a little time, yeah. So it's a very good that we have such kind of meetings like here. We living in university, we have take part in different conferences, but mostly we are focused on our own territories because the knowledge is so vast that it's very hard to be good, have a good knowledge in such kind of specific areas of the knowledge. So that's the situation, I think.
Thank you very much, Professor. That has stimulated some thinking. May I ask two interrelated questions?
Yeah.
I think the first is you mentioned the correspondence theory of truth. You could also add the coherence theory of truth. But my question is, what is the relationship of this to the transcendentalist view, to the Thomistic view? How is the correspondence and coherence theory of truth relate to transcendental truth? In other words, what is the relationship of truth to revelation?
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, shall I ask both questions together or one by one?
Maybe first one. I try to answer for this first one. Thank you. So you know, coherent truth I count as some kind of criterion of the truth. Yeah. So without this correspondence, a coherent criterion of truth can be misleading. Yeah, because we can have a coherent fairy tale. So without this reference to the adequacy theory of truth, we cannot build good coherent criterion. And what is the Thomistic? I said that we cannot use this theory knowledge truth without this metaphysical truth, with this truth which is represented by God Himself, because He is the ground for any kind of epistemological truth. Because without it, skeptical way is totally open. And I think that really we are living in such kind of times, because the reference to the God was lost, and now we are living in this post-truth area because each position is valid in the same way. Each position is valid the same way. So skeptical road is totally open in today's time, according to me. Even in the sciences. So I'm very sorry because of it. Because for years, I treat sciences as a science about brute facts. But now I'm not so sure in this position. I don't know if I answer for your questions, but the second one.
Thank you for permission to ask a second question. You mentioned classical paideia. Of course, classical paideia can also lead to Averroism, both in Christianity and in Islam. So I've been very interested for a long time that the very reasons given by the Bishop of Paris in condemning Averroism also had a parallel in Al-Ghazali in Islam. So these were, for example, the denial of creation, the denial of personal immortality, denial of the resurrection, the whole idea of double truth, Aristotle's teaching about natural slavery. You know, what I'm saying is paideia can also go wrong.
but you know, I see it in a little different way. When we are talking about paideia as some kind of building of the humanity by this truth, good, and beauty, so I treat these three concepts as a transcendental ideas, like St. Thomas Aquinas treated them. Yeah. So that's the common with the being, beauty, truth, and good. Yeah. So in this way, if we can recognize this transcendental feature of these concepts, so we can recognize that this building could go in the proper way. If that's true is express the truth about God, that good express the good about God, and beauty express the beauty of God. So I see in this way, because I agree with you that in ancient time, Aristotle maintained that slavery is a natural, and this Averroian situation, But I try to concentrate my focus on this transcendental feature of these three concepts.
Okay, so I have a question regarding your answer to Jakub, to the first question. So is it really so that today's disagreements about truth in the areas you mentioned, so climate change, vaccinations, is it really something so much different than what has been happening in the last centuries? So if we take, I don't know, heliocentric theory, if we take evolution, are the debates which were there in the sciences really kind of different from the ones that we have today? What do you think?
I think that the base problem is about the sources. 100 years ago, we base our convictions on the good sources from scientific investigations. That was discussed, that was different situation, congresses, and science is discussed, but now mostly we have knowledge from the internet. We took a lot of problems from the websites, and this is why in websites present are everything, without any serious discuss, without any serious arguments, and people flowing by this informations, mostly not justified, and this is why this disagreement is such huge in contemporary world. Disagreement is such huge in contemporary world because we have mostly no time for reading serious books, and this is why from internet is very easy. You click once and you receive what you need, but it is justified knowledge. Mostly probably not. But I am not a specialist in this area.
May I add something? Because I think it's the difference, also a question of credibility and reliability of, say, effect of research. What's connected with the evolution of the university as itself and the concept of what science deliver. Clark Kerr, the famous first rector of Harvard University, defined university as a kind of factory which deliver knowledge as a product to those who pay for research. So university it is a kind of a service institution which has two kinds of clients. One, it's students, and the second are the companies who owe the research. There is nothing like, say, ambitious of create a community. That's. I mean, when you are looking for something, what's an antipode? It's a definition of university by John Paul II, who says that the university it's the society of people searching for truth together. Clark Kerr says that the university it's a series of individual entrepreneurs held together by a common grievance for parking. I mean, it was an, let's say, I mean, it's a joke, but in that cynicism, in fact, is a very open statement of that what the university means. And the problem is that when you exclude a criteria of truth, you can't really find a real, you can't find a place from where you can derive a credibility of a universal character of that what you discover or offer. So we are in the, I mean, I've mentioned John Paul II, but say the fundamental referring point of that what deliver, I don't know, scientific research, fundamental for our culture. It's that what we can read in a Socratic dialogue about a Socrates in a prison, who says that he will not escape a prison because even in front of that what he said before must be true, because it's not a question of context. When you exclude truth from the field of your research, you are under a pressure of client. What's a criterion of being good institution for a client? It's a satisfaction of client, and it's obvious. And may it be a utility. In the pragmatic tradition, utility was trying to be put in a place which may replace truth. But the problem with utility is that when you read James, he's thinking that we may create utility as a universal criterion. But that's a mistake. I mean, that's a utility of a group always, at least of a client, of many clients. So, in fact, you can't create a universal criterion in that sense that you can't. That's somehow a paradox, because philosophy or science based on the concept of truth was criticized by a Frankfurt school, that the truth is let's say, tacit instrument of power. And in that place, we receive the utility, which is an open instrument of political and financial power, open one. I mean, instead of something which was, I mean, how the school, how the Frankfurters fought, instead of tacit instrument or unclear, we have an open cynicism. I mean, so that I would say it's the biggest difference between controversies around, for example, the climate or anthropological input in climate changes and Darwin theory. Although scientists insist that, of course, from the point of view of a scientific criterion, nothing happened, but there is no reason, that's not serious reason to believe on that. That's a problem now. So when we heard many times complaining of the scientific spheres that there is a big crisis of a credibility of science, I would say that it's a kind of the auto-aggression of Clark Kerr-like university effect. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much.
No, there's.
More questions. Okay.
I was just wondering, since we kind of swayed off so far from the truth, you know, and everyone is a little bit confused, you know, and with pluralism and relativism and skepticism and nihilism, as you said. Do you think that maybe we can treat goodness as prior to truth in a way, as
prior.
In some way prior to truth? I guess metaphysically we say they're convertible, but perhaps like the way of goodness could actually open us to the truth. And maybe the truth, like, it cannot really be defined, you know, it's something like you ascend to, but we as Christians, at least, we have a pretty clear path to knowing the truth, which is through living the good life and through living the life in the sacraments, you know, because we, for example, one last thing I'll say is the self-reflection of impediments, you know, impediment of the intellect, impediment of the will, you know. I kind of, unless I'm misinterpreting Aquinas, I would say that if you reason properly, then you know the truth. If there are impediments to your intellect or to your will, then you will act not according to the good or not according to the truth. So I was just wondering, like, if we flip it around, you know, instead of talking about truth so much, we start to talk about living the good life, truth will follow.
Yeah, but I think we don't have to disconnect these two concepts. Because, as I said, if we treat truth and good as a transcendental concept, So if you're searching for truth, you're searching also for good. If you're searching for good, you're searching also for truth. But the contemporary problem is this one, which I quoted by Wilkoszewska, that we are living in societies when achieving the truth is equal to destruction. It's equal to destruction. What more if you achieve the truth? If you find the truth? So nothing more. Nothing more happens. So this is why, it's some kind of internal human disconnections with the truth, because we need every day a little more. But Balthasar, I close his idea a little in my text also, says that each truth doesn't close us, open us for more. If you find one of the true, you are searching for more, because you know that stopped, and in the same way open for something more. And the same with the good. The same is the good. Yeah. If you find some kind of good, you are starting for looking some more goods. Yeah. So if we treat truth and good as a transcendental concept, as a base for our life, so we don't have to disconnect them. Conceptually, we do it because truth is different and good. But from the transcendental point of view, they are exchangeable. They are exchangeable. And this is why, in this way, our life can be beautiful. To the third transcendental concept. Yeah. When we're searching for truth and good, our life becomes beautiful life.
Is there another? If there is no another question, thank you very much, Professor, for your lecture. Let me share the information. The next event organized by the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture will be held on April 3rd to mark the 25 years since the canonization of Sister Faustina Kowalska. We'll be discussing the mystery of divine mercy in a theological approach and looking for places in the world today which are in special need of works of mercy. So we'll try to consider theology of mercy and the practice of mercy at the same time. So that's a part of answer on true and good together. Please save the date and be sure to join us there. Thank you very much again for you and for all the participants.